The humidity in the air was thick enough to choke on, a damp, heavy grayness that clung to the marble pillars of the Oak Ridge Luxury Lofts. Outside, the morning commute was a chaotic blur of splashing tires and frantic umbrellas, but inside the lobby, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. Marcus Thorne knelt on the cold, polished floor, his knees aching through the fabric of his faded work pants. He didn't mind the grime, he was used to it. He adjusted his grip on a heavy-duty wrench, his focus narrowed on the access panel of the primary elevator bank. To anyone passing by, he was just a ghost in a grease-stained hoodie, a piece of the building's plumbing that had somehow grown a pair of arms. He could hear the rhythmic, aggressive click of dress shoes on stone before he saw the man. It was a sound he knew well, the sound of someone who believed the ground existed solely to be stepped on by them. Lieutenant Bradley Miller strode into the lobby like he was leading a victory parade through a conquered city. He wasn't just walking, he was occupying space. Clad in a crisp, white military-style polo that looked like it had been ironed with a laser, he wheeled a mountain bike that probably cost more than Marcus's truck. Bradley stopped short, his tires screeching slightly against the marble, and he stared down at the toolbox splayed across the floor. He didn't say "excuse me." He didn't ask how the work was going. He simply sighed, a long, theatrical sound of pure, unadulterated annoyance that echoed off the high gold leaf ceilings. Bradley's eyes traveled from the grease on the floor to Marcus's scarred, dark hands, and finally up to his face, resting there with a look of profound distaste. Marcus didn't look away. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, leaving a smudge of oil behind, and waited for the inevitable. Bradley gestured vaguely at the tools with his chin, his voice dripping with the kind of forced patience one uses with a disobedient child. He asked Marcus if he realized that people actually lived there, paying people who didn't appreciate having to navigate a junkyard just to get to their morning coffee. He pointed a finger at a delicate multimeter sitting near the edge of the rug. He told Marcus that this was Oak Ridge, not a back alley garage, and that his eyesore clutter was a safety hazard for those who actually belonged in the building. Marcus felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, the same heat he'd felt decades ago in a different uniform, but he kept his voice low and steady. He told Bradley he'd be done in 10 minutes, explaining that the elevator sensor was faulty and he didn't want anyone getting stuck between floors. Bradley didn't care about the explanation. He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive, wood-paneled cologne clashing with the metallic scent of the elevator machinery. He told Marcus that he hadn't fought for this country just to come home and trip over the help in his own lobby. He ended the sentence with a sharp, biting, "Son," a word meant to remind Marcus exactly where he stood on the social ladder. The glass doors hissed open again, admitting Linda, the WA president. She marched over, her heels sounding like gunfire. She didn't even look at Marcus. She looked at Bradley, her face instantly melting into a sympathetic mask. She agreed with him, noting that unskilled workers were becoming a nuisance and that they really needed to implement a policy where they were cleared out by 5 p.m. so the residents could feel safe. The word safe hung in the air like a slur. As Bradley prepared to move past, his eyes caught the multimeter again. With a casual, almost bored flick of his boot, he kicked the expensive piece of equipment. It skidded across the marble and landed with a wet splash directly in a puddle of gray floor sealant that had leaked from a nearby bucket. The electronics hissed and died instantly. Bradley didn't even look back. He just laughed, a sharp, barking sound, and told Linda that the lobby was already looking better. Marcus stayed on his knees, his hand tightening around the wrench until his knuckles turned ash gray, watching the two of them disappear into the second elevator. He didn't shout. He didn't swear. He just looked at the ruined tool in the puddle and then at the gold-plated directory on the wall, his mind already moving several steps ahead of the man who thought he had just one. The smell of burnt ozone and wet sand always brought the memories back. As Marcus stared at his ruined multimeter, the polished marble of the lobby dissolved into the jagged, sun-scorched terrain of a remote valley in Afghanistan. It was 20 years ago, but the heat of that desert sun still felt like it was branding his skin. A younger Marcus, clad in sweat-soaked tactical gear and a heavy rucksack, knelt in the dirt just like he was kneeling now. Back then, he wasn't a handyman Ann was a sergeant first class, a combat engineer whose hands were the only thing standing between his platoon and a watery grave. The sound of mortar fire echoed in the distance, a low thrumming that vibrated in his teeth. His unit was pinned down, and the only way out was a crumbling stone bridge that had been partially demolished by an IED. Marcus could remember the grit in his mouth and the frantic beating of his heart as he worked under a hail of sporadic gunfire. He wasn't thinking about medals or glory, he was thinking about the 18 men behind him who wanted to see their families again. He had spent 6 hours in the killing zone, welding iron and hauling stone, his hands bleeding and his muscles screaming for mercy. Among those men was a young, pristine lieutenant named Bradley Miller. While Marcus was in the mud, risking his life to secure the structural integrity of the bridge, Bradley was hunkered down behind an armored transport 300 yards back. Marcus could still see Bradley's face through the dust, pale, panicked, and shouting orders into a radio for someone else to fix the mess. When the bridge was finally reinforced and the convoy moved across, Bradley had been the first one to snap a photo, the first one to file the report, and the first one to accept a commendation for logistical excellence, while Marcus was being loaded into a medevac. The explosion that followed was a blur of fire and sound. A secondary device had gone off just as Marcus was clearing the site. The blast had claimed the life of his best friend, David, and left Marcus with a leg full of shrapnel and a soul full of silence. He remembered lying in a hospital bed in Germany, staring at a ceiling that didn't move, wondering why the men who did the least always seemed to take the most. Bradley Miller had gone home to a hero's welcome and a family fortune, while Marcus had returned to a country that didn't know what to do with a man whose only skill was building things in a war zone. Coming back to the present was like being dunked in ice water. Marcus blinked, the luxury lobby of Oak Ridge slowly coming back into focus. The phantom pain in his leg throbbed, a dull reminder of the sacrifice Bradley had so easily forgotten. After the war, Marcus hadn't asked for handouts. He had started small, using his meager disability checks to buy a rusted van and a set of basic tools. He worked 20-hour days, fixing leaky faucets in the morning and hauling construction debris at night. He had built an empire out of the dirt, one brick at a time, moving from contractor to developer to owner, all while maintaining the quiet humility of a man who knew how quickly everything could be blown away. He looked up at the ceiling of the lobby he now technically owned, though the paperwork was still sitting in a leather briefcase in his truck. He realized Bradley didn't recognize him because men like Bradley never actually look at the people who serve them. To Bradley, the sergeant who built the bridge was just a tool, and the man fixing the elevator was just a nuisance. The prejudice that fueled Bradley's arrogance wasn't just about race or money. It was a deep-seated belief that he was the protagonist of the world and everyone else was just an extra. Marcus stood up slowly, his knee clicking as he straightened his posture. The shame Bradley tried to heap on him didn't stick. It couldn't. Marcus knew the weight of real metal and the cost of real blood. He looked toward the elevators where the lieutenant had disappeared, feeling a strange sense of calm. The tension of the past and the injustice of the present were merging into a single, focused purpose. He wasn't just here to fix an elevator anymore. He was here to see if the bridge Bradley had crossed 20 years ago was finally ready to collapse under the weight of his own ego. The morning sun was just starting to cut through the lingering fog when Bradley Miller's voice tore through the quiet luxury of the Oak Ridge lobby like a serrated blade. He wasn't just complaining anymore, he was on a mission. He stood by the concierge desk, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson, slamming a manicured hand onto the marble surface. He had found out that Marcus was staying in the small, windowless manager's unit tucked away near the service entrance, and to Bradley, this was an act of war. He paced back and forth, his chest puffed out, declaring to anyone within earshot that the building was being compromised by a squatter who looked like he'd just crawled out of a storm drain. Leo, a young man in his early 20s with wide, earnest eyes, stood near Marcus, clutching a clipboard to his chest. He was Marcus's protege, a kid from the neighborhood who Marcus was teaching the trade, and his hands were shaking. Leo stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly, trying to explain that Mr. Thorne had every right to be there and that he was working around the clock to modernize the building's aging electrical grid. But Bradley didn't even look at him. He simply put a hand up to Leo's face, dismissing him as if he were a buzzing fly, and told the boy to stay out of grown-up business before he found himself on the street too. The air in the lobby turned icy as Bradley reached into the pocket of his expensive slacks and pulled out his phone. He turned to the small crowd of residents who were gathering near the mailroom, his voice rising to a theatrical pitch. He told them to look at Marcus, to really look at the grease on his hoodie and the thuggish way he carried himself. Then, with a calculated, venomous smirk, Bradley announced that his gold-plated commemorative watch, a gift from his days in the service, had gone missing from his nightstand right after Marcus had been seen near the penthouse floor. It was a blatant, ugly lie, and everyone in the room knew it, but no one moved. The silence was deafening. Linda stood at Bradley's side, her arms crossed tightly over her designer blouse, nodding along like a rhythmic metronome of judgment. She checked her diamond-encrusted watch and told the crowd that this was exactly why they needed stricter vetting for service personnel. She didn't have a shred of proof, but her eyes were filled with a terrifying, hollow certainty. She looked at Marcus and told him it was such a shame that people like him always had to ruin things for themselves by being greedy. The heavy glass doors swung open, and two police officers stepped in, their boots clopping loudly on the stone. Bradley immediately shifted his persona, standing at a rigid, military attention to greet them. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus, his voice cracking with fake emotion as he told the officers he didn't feel safe in his own home. He demanded they search the suspect and the den he was living in downstairs. Marcus stood perfectly still, his face a mask of calm, even as the residents pulled out their phones to record the humiliation. He could see the red and blue lights reflecting off the gold leaf ceiling, a strobe light of injustice that made his blood run cold. Bradley stood just behind the officers, filming the entire encounter with a smug grin, whispering loud enough for the microphone to catch that this was what happened when you let bottom feeders into a 5-star zip code. He told the officers that Marcus probably didn't even pay taxes and that he was a parasite on a society that men like Bradley had bled to protect. The irony was a bitter pill in the back of Marcus's throat, but he didn't say a word. He watched as the officers, looking uncomfortable but pressured by the wealthy crowd, began to lead him toward the service stairs for the search. Isolation is a cold, physical weight. Marcus looked around the room, searching for a single eye that would meet his. The front desk clerk, a woman Marcus had bought lunch for just 2 days ago, looked down at her computer screen, her face pale with fear. The maintenance crew stood in the shadows of the hallway, their heads bowed. No one wanted to be the next target of Bradley's wrath. Marcus was completely alone in a building he had poured his soul into, surrounded by people who saw a criminal instead of a human being. As the officers reached for Marcus's arm, Bradley stepped closer, his breath hot against Marcus's ear. He told him that by the time the sun went down, there wouldn't be a square inch of this neighborhood where Marcus would be welcome. He told him that he was trash, and trash belonged in the bin. Marcus finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Bradley's with a terrifying, silent intensity. He didn't look like a victim, he looked like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He let the officers lead him away, but his mind was already miles ahead, calculating the exact moment the trap would finally snap shut. The search of the manager's unit was a calculated violation, a clinical ransacking of the only place Marcus had to rest his head. The officers went through his sparse belongings, the extra work shirts, the dog-eared books on structural engineering, and the small framed photo of his unit in Afghanistan, with a cold, detached efficiency. Bradley Miller stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, a victor surveying a conquered territory. When the officers eventually stood up and confirmed that there was no gold-plated watch to be found, Bradley didn't even blink. He simply shrugged and told them that Marcus must have ditched it in the trash chutes or passed it off to his little accomplice, Leo. Even without the evidence of theft, Bradley had achieved his goal. He turned to Linda, who was waiting in the hallway like a vulture, and reminded her that as WA president, she had the emergency powers to remove any person deemed a threat to the communal welfare. Within 30 minutes, Marcus was handed a formal trespass notice. He was being evicted from the manager's unit, effective immediately. He was given 10 minutes to gather what he could carry. The humiliation was absolute. As Marcus walked out of the building carrying a single duffel bag and his heavy metal toolbox, a few residents actually cheered. Bradley stood on the sidewalk, the rain misting off his expensive polo, and told Marcus to keep walking until he hit the city limits. Marcus reached his beat-up, rusted Ford F-150 and threw his bag into the passenger seat. He sat behind the wheel, the engine idling with a rough, uneven chug, and stared at the luxury tower in the rearview mirror. For a moment, his shoulders slumped. The weight of 20 years of being, the help, seemed to press down on him all at once. But then, a sleek, black Cadillac Escalade pulled up alongside his truck, its tinted windows gliding down with a silent, electric hum. Sarah Vance, a woman whose legal reputation was feared from Wall Street to the Capitol, stepped out into the rain. She didn't mind the water on her silk suit as she walked to Marcus's window and handed him a thick, leather-bound manila folder. She told him the wire transfer had cleared 3 hours ago. The former owners had signed the final indemnity waivers, and the deed had been digitally stamped by the county registrar. Marcus opened the folder. His eyes didn't flicker over the price tag, a staggering 8-figure sum, but instead rested on the signature line that officially listed MT Heritage Holdings as the sole proprietor of the Oak Ridge Luxury Lofts. He wasn't a squatter. He wasn't the handyman. He was the landlord. He owned the marble Bradley walked on, the air Bradley breathed, and the very roof over Bradley's head. A strange, quiet transformation came over Marcus. The slump in his shoulders vanished, replaced by the rigid, unbreakable posture of the sergeant first class he had once been. The victim died in that truck, and the planner was born. Sarah asked if he wanted her to call the police back to have Bradley and Linda cited for harassment immediately. She told him they could have the locks changed on the penthouse by nightfall. Marcus looked at the folder, then at Bradley, who was still standing under the building's awning, laughing and pointing at Marcus's old truck. Marcus told her no. He told her that if they struck now, Bradley would just play the victim and move to another building to ruin someone else's life. He wanted something more permanent. He told Sarah to withhold the public filing of the ownership change until Friday evening. He wanted the WA to feel like they were in total control. He wanted Bradley to throw his victory party. He wanted the villain to reach the very peak of his arrogance before the ground turned to smoke beneath him. As Marcus pulled away from the curb, his truck's engine backfired, a sound like a gunshot that made Bradley jump. Marcus didn't look back. He was no longer reacting to the storm, he was the one who was bringing the lightning. The following 3 days were a masterclass in calculated silence. While Bradley Miller spent his afternoons lounging by the rooftop pool, regaling a small circle of sycophants with the exaggerated story of how he personally secured the building from a dangerous transient, Marcus Thorne was operating from a command center that Bradley didn't even know existed. Marcus sat in a glass-walled office 30 floors above the city, the soft hum of high-end air conditioning replacing the damp chill of the Oak Ridge basement. He wasn't wearing a hoodie anymore. He wore a crisp white button-down with the sleeves rolled up, his eyes fixed on a glowing monitor that displayed the intricate financial web of every tenant in the building. The grind was methodical. Marcus didn't want a quick victory, he wanted a total one. He spent hours reviewing the Tier 1 luxury service contracts that Bradley so often touted. As he scrolled through the digital ledgers, a slow, grim smile spread across his face. He discovered that Bradley Miller, the man who preached about paying taxes and zip codes where people contribute, hadn't paid a single cent in luxury tier WA fees for over 6 months. He was coasting on his military title and his cozy relationship with Linda, the WA president. Marcus dug deeper into the building's original 1920s charter, a document so old and dense that most modern lawyers ignored it. There, buried in the archaic legal jargon, he found the silver bullet. A conduct clause stating that any resident found guilty of malicious harassment of building staff or intentional misappropriation of communal maintenance funds was subject to immediate lease termination and forfeiture of their security deposit. In the shadows of the Oak Ridge service corridors, Leo acted as Marcus's eyes and ears. The young man moved like a ghost, his phone tucked discreetly into his pocket, capturing the reality of life under Bradley's protection. He recorded Bradley standing in the lobby, loudly complaining that the smell of poverty still lingered near the elevators. He captured Linda taking a thick envelope from Bradley behind the mailroom, a clear kickback to keep his delinquency off the official board reports. Every video, every timestamp recording, was uploaded directly to Marcus's encrypted server. Marcus watched the footage with a cold, detached focus. He wasn't angry anymore. He was an engineer again, looking at a structural flaw that needed to be demolished. By Thursday afternoon, the trap was almost set. Marcus made 3 specific phone calls. The first was to the city's premier private security firm, staffed entirely by combat veterans who had served under honorable conditions. The second was to the most aggressive forensic auditor in the state. The third was to a local catering company, ordering the finest champagne and hors d'oeuvres for a grand reopening gala that the residents had been told was organized by the mysterious new corporate owners. Bradley received his invitation via a gold-trimmed card slid under his penthouse door. He laughed, telling Linda over the phone that finally, the building was being recognized for its prestige. He had no idea that the new management he was so eager to impress was currently sitting in a dark truck outside, watching him through the lobby security cameras. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting in his eyes. He thought about the ruined multimeter in the puddle and the way Bradley had called him, son. The silence of the trap was about to be broken, and the noise would be deafening. The Oak Ridge Luxury Lofts had never looked more opulent than they did on the night of the gala. The lobby, usually a place of quiet, sterile transitions, had been transformed into a theater of high society. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low hum of a string quartet playing a sharp, modern arrangement, and the air was thick with a cloying mixture of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of top-shelf champagne. It was a scene designed to stroke the ego of every resident who walked through the glass doors. Bradley Miller was in his element, a king returning to a throne he believed he had built himself. He wore his full-dress blues, the medals on his chest clinking with every arrogant stride he took across the marble. He held a crystal flute in one hand and used the other to grandly gesticulate as he held court near the center of the room. He was telling a group of captivated neighbors about the security crisis he had managed to avert just days prior. He laughed, the sound loud and grating against the music, as he described how he had personally escorted the trash out of the building. He told them that under his watch, the Oak Ridge would remain a sanctuary for the elite, and he basked in the admiring nods of people who were too comfortable to question his cruelty. Linda flitted around him like a nervous moth, her silk dress rustling as she checked her diamond watch every 30 seconds. She was frantic, her eyes darting toward the entrance every time the heavy doors hissed open. She kept adjusting the welcome plaque she held, a gold-engraved monstrosity intended for the new owner. She whispered to Bradley that she had heard the new CEO was a man of extreme discipline and old-school values, and she was desperate to show him that she had kept the rabble in line. Bradley just patted her hand with a smug, condescending smirk, telling her to relax because men of power always recognized their own kind. The atmosphere shifted the moment the black luxury SUVs pulled up to the curb. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the residents watched as a line of men in sharp, midnight blue suits stepped out. They weren't just security guards, they moved with the lethal, coordinated grace of a specialized military unit. They entered the lobby and formed a silent, intimidating corridor. Bradley stood a little straighter, his chest puffing out even further, ready to greet a fellow commander. He adjusted his tie and whispered to Linda that it was time to show this new billionaire that they were the ones who truly ran this building. When Marcus Thorne stepped through the door, the sound in the room didn't just fade, it vanished. He wasn't the man in the grease-stained hoodie anymore. He was a force of nature wrapped in a $5,000 charcoal suit that fit him like armor. His stride was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of a man who owned the very ground he was walking on. Behind him, Sarah Vance walked with her chin high, a leather briefcase tucked under her arm like a weapon. The silence was so heavy it felt like it might crack the marble floor. Bradley's brain seemed to short-circuit. He took a step forward, a confused, ugly laugh escaping his throat. He pointed a finger at Marcus, his face twisting into a sneer of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He told the room that this must be some kind of sick joke, some pathetic attempt at a protest. He shouted for security to get this janitor out of the gala before he ruined the expensive rugs. He turned to the other residents, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate arrogance, asking them if they could believe the audacity of a squatter trying to dress up like a human being. Marcus didn't stop until he was standing exactly 3 feet in front of Bradley. He didn't flinch at the shouting, he didn't even blink. He simply stood there, his presence dwarfing Bradley's despite the medals on the lieutenant's chest. The contrast was staggering. Bradley, sweating and frantic in a uniform that represented a service he had spent years exaggerating, and Marcus, calm and immovable, representing the hard-earned reality of power. Marcus looked Bradley up and down with a cold, clinical detachment, as if he were inspecting a faulty piece of machinery that was finally beyond repair. Linda stepped forward, her face a mask of horrified confusion, her voice trembling as she tried to demand who Marcus thought he was. Marcus finally turned his gaze to her, and the sheer intensity of his stare made her take a sharp step back, the welcome plaque trembling in her hands. He didn't answer her. He didn't need to. He turned his head slightly toward the podium at the front of the room, and as if on cue, the lead security officer stepped forward and adjusted the microphone. The trap was no longer silent, the jaws were open, and Bradley Miller was standing right in the center of them, still laughing because he couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't the one in charge. The silence in the lobby was so brittle it felt like a stray heartbeat could shatter it. Marcus Thorne stepped up to the mahogany podium, his movements fluid and precise. He adjusted the microphone with a hand that didn't shake, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Bradley Miller, who was still wearing an expression of bewildered contempt. Marcus didn't start with a shout, he started with a whisper that carried to every corner of the marble hall. He thanked everyone for coming to the grand reopening of the Oak Ridge Luxury Lofts. He noted that for many of them, he was a familiar face, the man who crawled through their crawl spaces, the handyman, who fixed their leaks while they looked through him as if he were made of glass. Bradley let out a sharp, mocking laugh, looking around at the other residents for support. He yelled out that he didn't know what kind of game the help was playing, but that Marcus needed to get off that stage before the real owner arrived to have him thrown in jail for impersonation. Bradley turned to the lead security guard, snapping his fingers with an entitled rhythm, and ordered him to remove the trash immediately. But the guard didn't move. In fact, the guard looked at Bradley with a thin, knowing smile and then bowed his head slightly toward the stage. Marcus leaned into the microphone, his voice shifting from quiet observation to a deep, resonant command that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. He told the room that they had all been waiting to meet the new owner of MT Heritage Holdings. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle, and then he looked Bradley dead in the eye. He announced that they were looking at him. He was the owner. He was the landlord. And as of 5 o'clock that evening, he was the sole arbiter of who stayed within these walls and who was cast out into the rain. The color didn't just leave Bradley's face, it was as if his very soul had been drained of light. His mouth hung open, his jaw working fruitlessly like a fish out of water. Linda, standing beside him, dropped the gold, welcome, plaque. It hit the marble with a discordant, metallic clang that echoed like a funeral knell. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, laminated photograph, the same one the officers had ignored during the search of his unit. He held it up for the room to see. It was a picture of a bridge in a desert, scorched by war and surrounded by smoke. He told Bradley that he remembered that bridge. He remembered the lieutenant who hid behind the armored transport while a sergeant bled in the mud to keep the convoy moving. He remembered the man who took the medals while his men took the shrapnel. Marcus's voice grew cold, a winter wind blowing through the luxury of the lobby. He told Bradley that he had spent 20 years building a legacy from the dirt, while Bradley had spent 20 years coasting on a reputation he never earned. He revealed to the stunned crowd that Lieutenant Miller hadn't paid his fees in 6 months, using his influence and Linda's corruption to live like a king on a pauper's budget. Sarah Vance stepped forward, pulling a stack of legal documents from her briefcase with a flourish. She began to read the violations aloud, harassment, misappropriation of funds, and the breach of the moral turpitude clause in the building's charter. With every word, Bradley seemed to shrink, his dress blues suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for him. The residents who had cheered his security measures just days before were now backing away from him as if he were radioactive. Marcus walked down from the podium, his boots clicking with a finality that silenced the room. He stood inches from Bradley, who was now trembling, his eyes darting around for an exit that didn't exist. Marcus told him that a home is a place for people who understand respect, not for those who kick the tools of the men who keep their world running. He reached out and slowly, deliberately, unpinned a small commemorative pin from Bradley's lapel, the one Bradley had used to justify his superiority. Marcus told him that he was no longer a resident of Oak Ridge. He was a trespasser. The glass doors opened, and the same police officers who had humiliated Marcus 3 days earlier stepped inside. This time, they weren't looking at the man in the hoodie. They looked at Marcus with a sharp, professional nod. Marcus didn't have to say a word. The officers walked straight to Bradley, who began to stammer, his voice a high-pitched, pathetic whine as he tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Bradley's wrists, the sound was the most satisfying melody Marcus had ever heard. He watched as the man who called him bottom feeder was led out into the night, stripped of his pride, his home, and his lies. The heavy glass doors of the Oak Ridge Luxury Lofts hissed shut behind Bradley Miller for the last time, the sound final and cold like a tombstone sliding into place. On the sidewalk, the rain had turned into a relentless downpour, soaking through his dress blues and making the metals on his chest feel like lead weights. He stood there, clutching a damp cardboard box filled with the remnants of his arrogance, a few cigars, a framed commendation he hadn't earned, and the gold-plated watch he had tried to use to ruin a better man. There were no town cars waiting for him, no neighbors to offer a ride. The same people who had laughed at his jokes an hour ago now looked through the lobby windows with expressions of icy detachment. He was no longer a lieutenant or a resident, he was just a man standing in the rain, learning the bitter taste of his own medicine. Inside the warmth of the lobby, Marcus Thorne watched the red and blue lights of the patrol car fade into the city traffic. He felt no surge of petty joy, only a profound sense of equilibrium restored. He turned to Leo, who was standing wide-eyed by the concierge desk, and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. Marcus told him that the building wasn't just going to be a fortress for the wealthy anymore. He announced that the manager's unit, the one he had been so cruelly evicted from, would be converted into a scholarship office for local trade students. He looked at the staff, the cleaners, and the security guards who had lived in fear of Bradley's whims, and he told them their wages were doubling, effective immediately. He wanted them to know that in this building, the person who fixed the pipes was just as important as the person who signed the checks. Linda didn't fare much better than her partner in crime. The forensic audit Marcus ordered was swift and merciless. By the following month, she was forced to resign from the WA in disgrace. Her reputation in the city's social circles evaporated like mist. She moved into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the far side of town, where the elevators were always broken and the hallways smelled of stale cabbage. She spent her days checking her diamond watch, which no longer held any power, waiting for phone calls from friends who had long ago deleted her number. She had spent her life building walls to keep people out, only to find herself trapped behind them, utterly alone. 5 years passed with the steady, quiet rhythm of a life well lived. Marcus Thorne stood on a sun-drenched lot across town, the smell of fresh sawdust and turned earth filling the air. He was no longer just the owner of Oak Ridge, he was the founder of the Thorne Legacy Project, a sprawling complex of affordable housing and veteran rehabilitation centers. He wore a simple polo shirt and a pair of sturdy work boots, a set of blueprints rolled up under his arm. He looked at the crane lifting a steel beam into place and saw not just a building, but a bridge, a real bridge this time, connecting people to a future they thought they had lost. As Marcus walked toward his truck, he caught sight of a man in a neon yellow vest picking up trash near the construction fence. The man moved with a pronounced limp and a slumped, defeated posture. It was Bradley Miller. He was working for a cut-rate private security firm, relegated to the graveyard shift at construction sites. Bradley didn't look up as the luxury truck pulled away. He was too busy staring at the dirt, his hands cracked and stained, finally understanding the weight of the tools he had once kicked into a puddle. He was living the life he had once mocked, a ghost of a man haunted by the shadow of the sergeant he had tried to bury. Marcus drove away, the city skyline reflecting in his rearview mirror. He knew that the world was full of people like Bradley, people who thought that a title or a bank account made them superior to the soul of the person standing in front of them. But he also knew that the truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how much dirt you throw on top of it. He reached out and touched the old, scarred multimeter sitting on his dashboard, the one he had repaired and kept as a reminder. He smiled, a quiet, peaceful expression. He had learned long ago that you should never judge a book by its cover, because you never know when the man in the grease-stained hoodie is the one who actually owns the library. Karma doesn't need a loud voice to be heard, it just needs time to make sure the right person is holding the keys.